The rain had not ceased for 3 days when the Duke of Ravenscroft's carriage finally turned onto the long drive leading to his ancestral home, its wheels cutting through mud that seemed determined to swallow everything whole on this dreary October evening in the year 1814. Frederick Ravenscroft sat rigid against the leather seat, his dark green riding coat still damp from the morning's inspection of a tenant farm, his boots splattered with evidence of the sodden countryside he had traversed in his haste to conclude his London business, and return to an estate that felt less like home with each passing month. At 34, he wore weariness like a second skin, the kind that settles into a man's bones when grief has been his constant companion for 3 long years and duty has become the only language he remembers how to speak. Through the rain-streaked window, Ravenscroft Hall emerged from the mist, its stone facade as grey and unyielding as the sky above. And Frederick found himself wondering, as he often did, whether the woman waiting inside would even notice his return, or whether she would continue her careful practice of existing in the same spaces while maintaining the vast distance that had defined their 8 months of marriage. Clara would be in the drawing-room at this hour, he supposed, perhaps reading or attending to correspondence, her posture perfect, her expression serene, betraying nothing of whatever thoughts occupied her mind, thoughts he had long ago concluded centered on regret for the bargain she had struck when poverty had forced her hand and his need for a mother for Thomas had forced his. Inside the great hall, Clara Ravenscroft stood motionless as the footman announced her husband's arrival, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch her late mother's cameo at her throat. The only inheritance her family's fall from grace had not managed to claim. The modest grey silk of her gown whispered against the marble floor as she moved forward to greet him with the precise courtesy their arrangement demanded, her heart performing its familiar ache as she watched him stride through the door, rain still glistening on his shoulders, his face set in that distant expression she had come to know so well. Their eyes met briefly, and Clara felt the words she longed to speak dissolve on her tongue as Frederick offered a curt nod and inquired after Thomas, already looking past her toward the stairs. "The boy is sleeping soundly in the nursery," she replied, her voice steady, despite the trembling she fought to conceal. "And dinner will be served within the hour if that suits your grace." The formality of her address hung between them like a curtain, neither knew how to draw aside, and Frederick merely inclined his head before retreating to his study to change, leaving Clara standing alone in the vast entrance hall with only the echo of his footsteps and the relentless drumming of rain against windows for company. Dinner passed in the same careful silence that had become their custom, the long table stretching between them like an accusation, and when Frederick excused himself to attend to correspondence, Clara watched him go with eyes that betrayed nothing of the tears she would shed alone in her chambers, tears he would never know existed, tears that fell every night when the darkness finally gave her permission to mourn the love she carried for a man who believed she despised him. Morning came too soon for Clara, who had spent the long hours of darkness weeping into her pillow until exhaustion finally claimed her, and now she sat at the breakfast table with eyes that burned despite the careful application of cool cloths Mrs. Colborne had pressed to her face before dawn. The rain continued its relentless assault against the windows of the breakfast room, casting the space in shades of grey that matched the heaviness in her chest, and she kept her gaze fixed on the cup of tea cooling before her, afraid that meeting Frederick's eyes would somehow reveal the shameful truth of her nightly grief. He sat at the head of the table, his own expression set in familiar lines of distant preoccupation, and when he glanced toward her, she felt rather than saw his attention catch momentarily on her face. "Your eyes appear irritated this morning," he observed, his tone carrying neither warmth nor particular concern, simply the flat observation of a man noting a change in weather. Clara's fingers tightened around her teacup as she summoned her practiced composure. "The fireplace smoke in my chambers," she replied, the lie sliding easily from lips well trained in concealment. "The flu has been troublesome since the weather turned." Frederick seemed prepared to respond, but at that moment the breakfast room door burst open and Thomas came rushing in, his nursemaid calling apologies from the corridor as the boy made directly for Clara with the single-minded determination only a child of 6 could muster. His favorite blue waistcoat was buttoned crookedly, and Clara noticed immediately that the torn pocket still gaped open, a repair she had promised to complete and had forgotten in the tumult of her private sorrows. "Mamma Clara!" the boy exclaimed, using the name he had bestowed upon her within weeks of her arrival at Ravenscroft Hall. "You said we might read more of Robinson Crusoe today after my lessons are finished. You did not forget." The transformation in Clara was immediate and profound as she turned toward the child, her strained features softening into genuine warmth, her red-rimmed eyes suddenly bright with an affection that asked nothing and gave everything freely. "I could never forget such an important engagement," she assured him, reaching out to straighten his waistcoat buttons with practiced ease. "And I see your pocket still requires my attention, which I shall remedy this very afternoon." Frederick watched this exchange from behind his newspaper, something uncomfortable stirring in his chest as he observed the easy intimacy between his wife and his son. An intimacy that seemed to exist in a different world entirely from the careful formality that governed every interaction Clara shared with him. The footman appeared bearing a silver tray with the morning's correspondence, and Frederick accepted it without looking away from the scene before him, watching as Thomas climbed onto the chair beside Clara and began chattering about his toy soldiers while she listened with every appearance of genuine interest. Among the letters lay one bearing his sister's seal, and Frederick broke it open to discover that Lady Beatrice Montague intended to arrive 3 days earlier than originally planned, her carriage expected by week's end, and though he told himself the tension in his shoulders came from the disruption to household routine, some deeper part of him recognized it as dread for reasons he refused to examine. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The nursery had been transformed in the 8 months since Clara's arrival at Ravenscroft Hall, its once austere walls now softened by watercolor paintings Thomas had made under her patient guidance, its windowsills lined with the toy soldiers the boy arranged and rearranged in endless campaigns of imagination, and on this October afternoon, a small vase of late autumn chrysanthemums stood defiant against the grey light filtering through windows that had finally ceased their weeping as the rain slowed to a hesitant mist. Clara sat in the worn armchair by the fire, Thomas pressed close against her side, his small body warm and trusting as she held the well-thumbed copy of Robinson Crusoe open before them, her voice rising and falling with the adventures of the castaway, while the boy listened with the fierce concentration only a child of 6 can sustain. She had taken over his reading lessons within weeks of her marriage, discovering with quiet horror that Frederick had left the task to a succession of indifferent tutors who came and went without establishing any connection to the lonely child who had lost his mother before he could form memories of her face. Now Thomas read simple passages himself, his finger tracing the words while Clara guided him through the difficult ones, and she felt in these moments a love so fierce and uncomplicated that it almost made bearable the ache that lived perpetually in her chest. The distant sound of hooves on gravel announced Frederick's departure for the village, some business with the tenants that required his attention, and Clara felt the familiar mixture of relief and longing that accompanied his absence, grateful to breathe freely while simultaneously missing a presence that brought her nothing but pain. Thomas looked up from the page, his dark eyes so like his father's that Clara sometimes had to look away, and asked with the devastating directness of childhood why Papa never smiled at her the way he smiled at no one else either, but especially not at her when she was so nice and read him stories and fixed his waistcoat and made the house smell like flowers instead of dust. Clara's hand stilled on the page, her heart clenching at the question she had no way to answer honestly, and she managed only to say that his father carried many responsibilities that weighed heavily upon him, that grown people sometimes forgot how to show what they felt, that he must not worry himself over matters between adults. But Thomas was not satisfied. his small brow furrowing in a way that reminded her painfully of Frederick when he puzzled over estate accounts, and he declared that he would find a way to make things better because he was clever, and because he did not like it when she was sad. Clara assured him she was not sad, even as she felt the telltale sting behind her eyes, and she redirected his attention to the book with a brightness she did not feel, unaware that Thomas had heard her crying through the connecting door between his nursery and her chambers, unaware that his childish mind was already turning over this adult mystery with determination that would soon change everything. Lady Beatrice Montague's carriage arrived at Ravenscroft Hall precisely at 11 o'clock on the morning of October 6th, and Clara stood in the entrance hall with her hands clasped before her, and her spine held rigid as she watched the footman hurry to assist Frederick's sister from the elegant conveyance, noting with the sharp awareness of one who has learned to measure her own worth against others, that Beatrice's burgundy travelling dress was cut from fabric that would have cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe combined. The weather had turned decidedly cold overnight, and Clara felt the chill seeping through the stones of the great house as she forced her features into an expression of polite welcome, though her stomach churned with the particular dread that always accompanied Beatrice's visits, a dread born of 8 months enduring the woman's elegant cruelties delivered with smiles sharp enough to draw blood. Frederick had ridden out early to inspect damage from the recent rains, leaving Clara to receive his sister alone, and she could not decide whether his absence was a mercy or an abandonment. As Beatrice swept into the hall with her travelling cloak billowing behind her and her dark eyes already cataloguing every inadequacy of Clara's modest grey morning dress. "My dear sister," Beatrice exclaimed with warmth that never quite reached her gaze, "how pale you look. Country life must not agree with you, though I suppose one cannot expect a woman of your origins to thrive in such grand surroundings." Clara led her sister-in-law to the drawing-room where a fire crackled against the October chill, and she noticed how Beatrice's attention, immediately fixed upon the portrait of Sophia that hung above the mantelpiece, Frederick's first wife captured in oils with her golden hair and serene smile, a constant reminder to Clara of all she could never be. "Such a beauty she was," Beatrice observed, settling into the best chair with the proprietary air of one who considered herself the true mistress of the house. "Frederick was devastated when she died. Simply devastated. I sometimes wonder if he shall ever recover from losing his one true love." The words landed precisely where Beatrice intended them, and Clara felt each one like a blade slipped between her ribs as she poured tea with hands she willed not to tremble, murmuring something appropriate about the late Duchess's memory, while her heart cracked along familiar fault lines. Beatrice continued in her dulcet poison, remarking how generous Frederick had been to offer Clara the protection of his name, given her family's unfortunate circumstances, how Clara must be grateful every day for his charity, even if the match brought him nothing but the burden of her modest dowry and plainer face. The drawing-room door burst open then, and Thomas came rushing in with his nursemaid calling apologies behind him, but the boy ignored his aunt entirely and ran straight to Clara, wrapping his arms around her waist and declaring that he had finished his sums early, and might they please read together now. Clara watched Beatrice's expression sour at this display of preference, and she gathered Thomas close with a tenderness that asked nothing of performance, pressing a kiss to his dark hair, while something fierce and protective kindled in her chest, a reminder that even if Frederick could never love her, this child did, and perhaps that would have to be enough to sustain her through whatever fresh wounds Beatrice intended to inflict during her stay. The candle on Clara's dressing table had burned low by the time Mrs. Colborne finished unhooking the grey silk dress that had felt like armour throughout the interminable dinner, throughout the hours of sitting across from Beatrice's knowing smiles and Frederick's impenetrable silence. And now, as the gown pooled at her feet, Clara felt as though the last of her defences had fallen with it, leaving her exposed in her simple white nightgown to the full weight of a grief she could no longer contain. The rain had returned with the darkness, wind howling against the windows of her chambers, as if the October night itself sought to intrude upon her solitude. And Clara stood motionless, while Martha Colborne gathered the discarded dress with the gentle efficiency of a woman who had served her for 3 years and knew precisely when words were needed and when silence was the greater kindness. But tonight, the tears came before Clara could retreat to the privacy of her bed, spilling down her cheeks in hot tracks that she did not bother to wipe away, and she heard herself say in a voice scraped raw that she could not do this any more, could not wake each morning to the portrait of a dead woman she could never equal, could not endure another meal where Frederick looked through her as though she were made of glass, could not survive another visit from Beatrice with her poisoned sympathy and her careful reminders that Clara was nothing but a charity case given a title she had not earned. Mrs. Colborne set aside the dress and crossed to her mistress with the decisive movements of one who had held her tongue long enough, taking Clara's cold hands in her warm ones and declaring that Lady Beatrice was a viper who would say anything to cause pain, that the Duke was a fool blinded by his own stubborn pride, that Clara was worth 10 of his fine first wife, who by all accounts had been beautiful and cold as a marble statue. Clara shook her head, the sobs coming harder now as she confessed what she had never spoken aloud to anyone, that she loved him, that she had loved Frederick almost from the beginning when he had spoken his vows with such grave courtesy, and looked at her with eyes that held no warmth but also no cruelty, that she had hoped foolishly that patience and time might teach him to see her, but 8 months had proven only that she was invisible to him, and always would be. Mrs. Colborne guided her to the bed, pulling back the covers and helping her settle against the pillows, while murmuring assurances that Clara barely heard through her weeping. And when the older woman finally withdrew with promises to return in the morning, Clara curled onto her side and let the grief pour out of her in great shuddering waves that she muffled against her pillow. She did not know that the connecting door to the nursery stood slightly ajar from her earlier visit with Thomas, did not know that a small boy lay awake in his bed, listening to the sounds of her heartbreak, with his hands pressed over his ears, and tears of his own sliding silently toward his pillow, did not know that in his 6-year-old mind a resolution was forming with the fierce simplicity of childhood that he would tell his father the truth and make him fix what was so clearly broken. Frederick Ravenscroft sat behind the mahogany desk in his study on the morning of October 7th with ledgers spread before him that he had not truly seen for the better part of an hour, his mind circling instead around the image of an empty chair at the breakfast table and the servant's quiet explanation that her Grace begged to be excused due to a headache. And though he had nodded and returned his attention to his toast, he found now that he could not shake the memory of how Clara had looked the previous evening at dinner, her face pale as winter frost and her eyes holding a quality he could not name, but which had settled into his chest like a stone he could not dislodge. The study surrounded him with its familiar weight of dark wood paneling, and the stern portrait of his father gazing down from above the fireplace, with the same expression of duty and expectation that had governed every choice Frederick had made since boyhood, and he wondered now, as he stared at those painted eyes, whether the old Duke had ever questioned the choices he made, or whether certainty had come to him as naturally as breathing in a way it never had to his son. A knock interrupted his brooding, and Beatrice swept in without waiting for permission, settling herself in the leather chair opposite his desk with the air of one who considered herself entitled to his time and attention regardless of his wishes, and Frederick watched her arrange her burgundy skirts with precise movements, while something uneasy stirred in his gut that he attributed to the estate accounts rather than her presence. She spoke of Clara almost immediately, her tone rich with false concern, as she observed that the country did not seem to suit his new wife, that a woman of Clara's background surely craved the distractions of London society, that perhaps Frederick should consider whether keeping her buried in the countryside was entirely fair to a creature accustomed to more modest entertainments. Frederick found himself frowning at the suggestion, even as part of him seized upon it as explanation for Clara's pallor and withdrawal, and he asked Beatrice what she meant by Clara's background in a tone sharper than he intended, watching his sister's eyes flicker with something calculating before she smoothed her expression into sisterly solicitude. She spoke of the Ashworth family's fallen circumstances with delicate pity that somehow managed to wound, and Frederick remembered suddenly how Clara had trembled during their wedding ceremony, with her fingers cold as ice in his grip, how he had interpreted that trembling as reluctance, when perhaps it had been something else entirely, fear or grief or the weight of sacrificing herself for a family that had left her no other choice. The study door opened again, and Thomas appeared in the doorway asking for Clara, his small face tight with an anxiety that seemed too large for a child of 6 years, and Frederick noted how Beatrice's expression soured at the boy's obvious preference for his stepmother, noted too how Thomas barely acknowledged his aunt before retreating to search elsewhere for the woman who had become more mother to him in 8 months than Sophia had managed in the years before her death. And for the first time, Frederick allowed himself to wonder whether everything he believed about his second marriage might be terribly and completely wrong. The afternoon of October 8th found Frederick walking the garden paths with his son in what had become a ritual of obligation rather than pleasure, the Duke measuring his strides to match the shorter legs of the boy who trotted beside him while searching for something to say that might bridge the vast distance between them, and he found himself asking about lessons and deportment in the same tone his own father had used, formal and distant and utterly inadequate. For a child of 6 years who deserved warmth, he did not know how to give. Thomas answered dutifully about his studies, about the Latin words Clara had been teaching him, and the sums she made into games, so he would not find them tedious, and Frederick noted with a pang how every answer circled back to his stepmother, as though she had become the fixed point around which the boy's world revolved. The garden paths remained muddy from days of rain, though the sky had cleared to a pale autumn blue, and Frederick guided them toward the old oak where he had climbed as a child, thinking perhaps to share that memory before the impulse died in his throat as it always did. He noticed then that Thomas wore his favorite blue waistcoat, the one with the torn pocket he had seen hanging loose just days ago, and now the pocket sat neatly mended with stitches so small and even they were nearly invisible. And when he commented on the repair, Thomas's face lit with a brightness that made Frederick's chest ache, as the boy explained that Clara had fixed it, that Clara always fixed things, that Clara made everything better. They stood beneath the oak with its leaves turning gold and copper overhead, and Frederick was preparing to suggest they return to the house when Thomas stopped walking and looked up at him with an expression far too serious for his years, his small hands clenched at his sides as though steeling himself for something that frightened him. And then the words came tumbling out in a rush that Frederick would remember for the rest of his life. "She cries every night when you leave," Thomas said, his voice trembling but determined. "She cries, and I hear her through the door between our rooms, and I put my hands over my ears, but I can still hear her, and I do not understand why you make her so sad when she is the kindest person in the whole world." Frederick felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as though the earth itself had tilted, his mind struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he had believed about his marriage. And he heard himself demanding explanation in a voice gone hoarse, while Thomas explained about the connecting door and the sounds that carried through it, about the nights he had lain awake listening to his stepmother weep, and Frederick stood frozen beneath the oak tree, where he had once been a careless boy who believed the world made sense, understanding now that he had been blind and that his blindness had caused suffering. He could not begin to measure. Frederick returned to his study in a state of such profound disorientation that he could not afterward recall crossing the garden or climbing the stairs, finding himself simply there before the cold hearth with the afternoon light fading to amber and gold beyond the windows, while his mind replayed every moment of the past 8 months with the terrible clarity of a man who has just discovered he has been living in a house of mirrors and seeing only distortions. "She cries every night when you leave," Thomas had said, and those words echoed now through the chambers of Frederick's memory as he sank into the chair behind his desk and pressed his hands against his eyes as though he could block out the parade of images that assaulted him. Clara at their wedding with her fingers trembling in his grasp and her face pale as chalk, Clara at dinner after dinner, sitting across from him with that careful composure he had interpreted as coldness, when perhaps it had been armor against his own withdrawal. Clara turning away each time he entered a room with what he had believed was disgust, but might have been something else entirely, something that looked like pain or longing or the desperate self-protection of a woman who believed herself unwanted. The fire had died to embers, and the study grew cold around him, but Frederick did not move to summon a servant or stir the coals himself, too consumed by the excruciating work of re-examining every assumption he had made about his marriage, and he found himself returning again and again to their wedding night, when he had gone to her chamber as duty demanded, and found her sitting rigid on the edge of the bed in her white nightgown, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone bloodless, and he had asked if she wished him to leave, and she had whispered yes in a voice that shook. And he had retreated to his own rooms, believing she could not bear his touch, when perhaps she had been terrified of revealing feelings he would not return. The portrait of Sophia watched him from across the room with her serene painted smile, and Frederick realized with a jolt of shame that Clara had never once asked for it to be moved, though it hung in the most prominent position in the house, that she had walked past the image of his first wife every single day without complaint, while Beatrice whispered poison about how Frederick could never love anyone as he had loved Sophia. And the truth was that his first marriage had been as cold and empty as this one appeared, but he had learned to call that emptiness contentment because it was easier than admitting he had failed at the one thing that should have come naturally. From somewhere deep in the house came the sound of Thomas laughing, bright and uninhibited, in a way the boy never laughed with Frederick, and beneath that childish joy he heard Clara's voice gentle and warm, and everything he had never allowed himself to hope she might feel for anyone in this household, and Frederick made a decision in that moment that felt like the first real choice he had made in years. He would discover the truth of his wife's heart, and if there was any chance Thomas was right, then he would spend whatever remained of his life earning the love he had been too much a coward to seek. The morning of October 9th dawned with weak autumn sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the breakfast room, casting pale golden rectangles across the white linen tablecloth where Frederick sat alone waiting for his wife to appear, his coffee growing cold in its cup as he rehearsed and discarded a dozen different ways he might speak to her, might bridge the chasm that yawned between them with some small gesture that would not send her retreating further behind her walls of careful composure. And when Clara finally entered the room, his breath caught in his throat at the sight of her, because he was seeing her now, with eyes stripped of the assumptions that had blinded him for 8 long months. She wore a dark blue dress today, rather than her usual grey, the colour bringing out the shadows beneath her eyes and the pallor of her cheeks, and Frederick noticed with a sharp twist of guilt that her figure had grown thinner since their wedding day, that the gown hung looser at her waist than it should, that she moved with the careful deliberation of someone conserving strength against some invisible weight pressing down upon her shoulders. He rose as she entered, because even in his confusion he remembered his manners, and Clara startled at the attention, as though she had expected him to ignore her presence entirely, her eyes meeting his for one brief, unguarded moment, before she looked away and murmured her good morning in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear it across the width of the room. Frederick searched for something to say, some opening that might invite her to linger rather than flee, and he heard himself asking about her morning in a tone he hoped sounded warm rather than interrogative, watching her face for any sign that she welcomed his interest. But Clara only blinked at him with something like confusion before answering that she had slept tolerably well and planned to attend to household accounts after breakfast, her words polite and empty and designed to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Before Frederick could try again, Beatrice swept into the room in her burgundy dress with its elaborate trim, positioning herself at the table between husband and wife with the precision of a general claiming strategic ground, and she immediately engaged Frederick in questions about the estate and the tenants and a dozen other matters that required his attention, her bright chatter filling the silence that Clara seemed grateful for as she bent her head over her plate and ate nothing at all. Frederick watched his wife over his sister's shoulder, noting how Clara's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, how she flinched almost imperceptibly when Beatrice laughed too loudly, how she excused herself before the meal was half finished with a murmured apology about duties awaiting her elsewhere. And as she passed his chair, he caught the faint scent of lavender that always clung to her hair and felt something crack open in his chest at the realization that she was disappearing before his eyes, and he had been too blind and too proud to see it happening. Beatrice was watching him with narrowed eyes when he turned back to the table, something calculating in her expression that he had never noticed before but recognized now for what it was. And Frederick understood in that moment that his sister had been playing a game he had not known was being played at all. The clock in the downstairs hall had just finished striking 9 when Frederick positioned himself in the shadowed alcove near the east wing corridor where Clara's chambers lay beyond a heavy oak door that he had not passed through since their wedding night 8 months ago, and he stood there in the darkness with only a single candle flickering in its wall sconce to break the gloom while his heart pounded against his ribs with a force that seemed loud enough to echo through the silent house, telling himself that he needed to know the truth, even as some part of him already understood what he would discover and dreaded the confirmation of his own blindness and failure. The hallway stretched before him in pools of shadow and faint amber light, the portraits of his ancestors watching from their frames with expressions that seemed to judge him for lurking outside his own wife's door like a thief in his own home. But Frederick could not bring himself to move either forward or back, because Thomas's words had lodged themselves in his chest like shards of glass, and he needed to feel them cut deeper before he could begin to heal the wounds he had inflicted through 8 months of careful, cowardly distance. He heard it then, faint at first, and almost indistinguishable from the wind that rattled the windows at the end of the corridor, a sound that made his breath catch and his hands curl into fists at his sides, the unmistakable rhythm of muffled sobbing filtering through the heavy door. And Frederick closed his eyes against the wave of anguish that crashed over him, because this was real and true, and happening every night while he sat in his study convincing himself that Clara wanted nothing to do with him. The crying continued in broken waves, sometimes quieting to shuddering breaths before building again to sounds of such profound grief that Frederick had to press his palm against the cold stone wall to steady himself, and he thought of all the mornings he had seen her red-rimmed eyes and believed her explanations of smoke or late reading or the dust in the library, all the times he had watched her compose her features into that mask of pleasant neutrality, and assumed it was distaste for his company, rather than the desperate armor of a woman trying to survive in a house where she believed herself unwanted. The door opened without warning, and Mrs. Colburn emerged carrying a basin of water and a cloth that had clearly been used to minister to her weeping mistress, and the older woman stopped short at the sight of Frederick standing there, in the shadows with his face pale as marble in the candlelight, her expression shifting through surprise, and then something that looked almost like grim satisfaction, before she dropped a curtsy and murmured "Your Grace" in a tone that carried layers of meaning Frederick was only beginning to understand, and as she passed him, he saw in her eyes both accusation and a glimmer of hope that perhaps he had finally come to witness what she had been watching helplessly for months, and Frederick stood rooted to the spot long after her footsteps faded down the corridor, because he understood now with terrible clarity that he had been the architect of his wife's suffering, and only he could tear down the walls he had built between them. The morning of October the 10th found Frederick standing behind his desk in the study where generations of Ravenscroft men had conducted the business of the estate. But today, the ledgers lay untouched and the correspondence sat unopened because Frederick had summoned his sister to this room for a conversation that would shatter the careful balance of power that had existed between them since childhood, and when Beatrice swept through the door in her burgundy dress with its elaborate trim. She wore an expression of pleasant curiosity that faltered only slightly when she saw her brother standing, rather than seated, his posture rigid, and his eyes carrying a coldness she had never seen directed at herself. Frederick did not invite her to sit, did not offer the courtesies that had always marked their interactions, and Beatrice's smile flickered as she sensed the change in the air between them. her hand rising to touch the pearls at her throat, in a gesture that betrayed her sudden uncertainty, even as she attempted to maintain her composure with a light remark about the early hour for such a formal summons. "You will leave Ravenscroft Hall today," Frederick said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of the Duke he had been raised to become, but had rarely exercised within the walls of his own home. And Beatrice's face went pale, then flushed with indignation as she demanded to know what had prompted such treatment, her voice rising with the confidence of a woman who had spent years believing herself indispensable to her brother's happiness. Frederick watched her performance with eyes that now saw clearly the manipulation woven through every concerned word and helpful suggestion she had offered since Clara had become his wife, and he thought of all the times Beatrice had whispered poison about Clara's unsuitability while pretending to sympathize with his imagined plight, all the careful insinuations that had reinforced his belief that Clara found their marriage as distasteful as he had been convinced she must. "You have treated my wife with cruelty," Frederick continued, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Beatrice step backward despite herself. "And you have spent 8 months ensuring that I remained blind to her suffering while you fed her despair with your venom, and I will not permit you to remain under this roof 1 hour longer than necessary." Beatrice attempted her usual tactics then, her expression shifting to wounded innocence as she protested that everything she had done was out of love for him, that Clara was beneath him and had trapped him into this marriage, and surely he could see that she deserved better than a penniless nobody who could never replace dear Sophia. But Frederick cut her off with a raised hand and a single word that silenced her more effectively than any shouting could have done. "Enough," he said, and in that word was the death of the old Frederick, who had allowed others to shape his perceptions, and the birth of a man who would fight for the wife he had failed for too long. And Beatrice saw something in his face that told her she had finally pushed too far and lost the brother she had controlled since boyhood. The portrait of their father watched from the wall as Frederick ordered the carriage prepared and Beatrice's things packed, and though she made one final attempt to sway him with tears that had always worked before, Frederick simply turned away and looked out the window toward the garden where he had walked with Thomas, and his sister understood at last that she had been dismissed not just from the house, but from the center of his life forever. The library had become Clara's sanctuary in the 8 months since she had arrived at Ravenscroft Hall as a bride who knew herself unwanted, and she sat now in the window seat, where autumn light filtered through glass that needed cleaning, a book open on her lap, though she had not turned a page in nearly an hour because her mind kept returning to the strange events of the morning that had seen Lady Beatrice's carriage departing down the long drive with unusual haste and none of the elaborate farewells that typically accompanied her visits. Clara had watched from this very window as the burgundy-clad figure climbed into the carriage without a backward glance at the house, and though she knew she should feel relief at the departure of a woman who had spent days reminding her of her inadequacy and her husband's eternal devotion to his first wife, she felt instead a creeping unease, because something had clearly happened that she did not understand, and in her experience, unexpected changes rarely brought good fortune to women in her position. Mrs. Colburn entered with a tea tray that Clara had not requested, setting it down on the small table beside the window seat with movements that seemed deliberately unhurried, and when Clara looked up to thank her, she found the older woman watching her with an expression that held something Clara could not quite name, something that looked almost like anticipation mixed with a fierce, protective satisfaction. "His Grace dismissed her himself this morning," Mrs. Colburn said quietly as she poured tea into the delicate cup that had belonged to the previous Duchess, and Clara's hand trembled slightly as she accepted it, because she could not imagine what would prompt Frederick to send away his own sister, when Beatrice had always held such influence over him and had made no secret of her belief that Clara was unworthy of the Ravenscroft name. Clara wanted to ask why, wanted to demand every detail of what had transpired in that study where she herself never ventured, but the words caught in her throat because hoping for too much had always led to disappointment, and she had learned long ago that protecting her heart meant never reaching for things that might be snatched away. Yet even as she schooled her features into careful neutrality, she could not stop herself from remembering Frederick's eyes at breakfast yesterday, the way he had looked at her with something that might have been concern when he asked about her mourning. And though she had retreated from his attention out of habit and fear, she wondered now if she had misread him as thoroughly as she had apparently misread this household's shifting alliances. The tea grew cold in her hands as Clara sat very still in the autumn light, and though she told herself that Beatrice's departure meant nothing and changed nothing between herself and the husband who had never wanted her, she could feel something stirring beneath the careful resignation she had worn like armor, something fragile and dangerous that felt terribly like hope, and she pressed her mother's cameo against her throat as if the familiar weight could anchor her against the tide of longing that threatened to sweep away the walls she had built to survive in this beautiful, cold house. The afternoon light had shifted to the deeper gold of approaching evening when Clara finally set aside her cold tea and rose from the window seat, her limbs stiff from sitting so long in contemplation of mysteries she dared not solve. And she moved through the library with the restless energy of a woman who has spent too many hours trapped inside her own thoughts and fears, the conclusions she might reach if she remained still any longer. She paused before the tall windows that overlooked the garden where she had watched Frederick walk with Thomas just days ago, and she remembered how distant they had seemed from each other, father and son moving through the autumn landscape like strangers who happened to share the same path. And she had ached for both of them then, as she ached now for herself and for the husband who seemed forever beyond her reach. The garden lay quiet in the fading light, the roses she had planted in spring now bare of blooms and waiting for winter, and Clara pressed her palm against the cool glass and wondered if she too was simply waiting, suspended between seasons, unable to move forward into whatever life held for her in this house where she had thought she might wither and die of loneliness. Mrs. Colborne's words echoed in her mind, the careful way she had said, "His Grace dismissed her himself," and Clara turned the phrase over and over like a stone, worn smooth by water, searching for meaning in the emphasis, in the look that had accompanied it, in the small smile that had played at the corners of her maid's mouth as she poured tea. Clara had been too distracted to drink. She thought of Frederick's eyes at breakfast, the way he had looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, and she thought of how she had fled from that gaze because she had learned that hope was the cruelest companion of all, and she could not bear to be disappointed again by a man who had never wanted her. Yet something had changed in this house. Something had shifted in the foundations of the careful arrangement they had maintained for 8 months, and Clara could feel it in the air, like the change of weather that preceded a storm. She moved to the small writing desk where she conducted household correspondence and sat down before the neat stacks of papers that represented her domain, the one area where Frederick had never questioned her competence, and her hand trembled slightly as she straightened pages that did not need straightening because she needed something to do with her fingers, while her heart raced with feelings she could not name. The portrait of Sophia watched her from across the room, beautiful and serene and forever young in death, and Clara met those painted eyes and wondered for the first time if she might someday be more than a pale shadow of the woman who had come before her, if Frederick might someday look at her and see not a replacement, but a wife worthy of the name she bore. Frederick found Clara in the library as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening, and he paused in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her before she became aware of his presence, taking in the way she sat at the writing desk with her shoulders curved inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller and less noticeable, and he felt his heart clench with the recognition that he had taught her to shrink like this through months of cold formality and careful distance that he had mistaken for respect, but now understood to be cowardice of the most damaging kind. She looked up when the floorboard creaked beneath his boot, and her eyes went wide with something that might have been fear or might have been hope. And Frederick realized with a pain that stole his breath that his wife could not tell the difference between those emotions when it came to him, because he had given her no reason to expect kindness, and every reason to brace for indifference. He crossed the room slowly, aware that she watched him the way a deer watches a hunter, ready to flee at any sudden movement, and he hated himself for making her feel this way in what should have been her home and her sanctuary. Clara rose from her chair as propriety demanded when he approached, her hands clasped before her in that gesture he now recognized as self-protection rather than the cold composure he had once believed it to be, and he saw the question in her eyes even as she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace," she said in that quiet voice she always used with him, so different from the warm tones he had overheard when she spoke with Thomas or Mrs. Colborne, and the formal address cut him like a blade because it reminded him of all the walls they had built between them. Frederick stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the faint shadows beneath her eyes and the slight trembling of her fingers, close enough to catch the scent of lavender that always surrounded her and that he had pretended not to notice for 8 months of marriage. "I sent Beatrice away," he said, and he watched her face carefully for any reaction, saw the flicker of surprise quickly suppressed, saw the way her lips parted slightly before she pressed them together again. "I should have done so the moment she arrived," he continued, his voice rough with emotion he had spent years learning to hide. "But I was blind to many things, Clara, and I am only now beginning to see clearly." She stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language, and he supposed in a way he was because they had never spoken honestly to each other, had never moved beyond the careful courtesies that governed their arrangement, and he knew that the words he needed to say would either build a bridge between them or confirm every fear that had kept them apart. The portrait of Sophia watched from across the room, and Frederick made a silent promise to remove it tomorrow, to finally lay his first wife to rest, and make room in this house for the living woman who stood before him now with hope and terror warring in her beautiful eyes. Clara stood frozen before her husband, her heart beating so violently she was certain he must hear it in the quiet of the library, where the fading afternoon light cast long shadows across the floor, and the portrait of Sophia watched from the wall as it always had, a silent reminder of the woman who had come before and who had held Frederick's heart in ways Clara had never dared to hope she might. She searched his face for some sign of what this meant, this sudden attention, this unprecedented declaration that he had sent his sister away and that he had been blind, and she found herself unable to speak because the words she had carried in silence for 8 months pressed against her throat and threatened to spill out in a flood that would expose every secret longing she had hidden behind formal courtesies and careful distance. Frederick took another step toward her, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, something that looked almost like pain, almost like hope, and her hands trembled at her sides as she waited for him to continue speaking, because she could not trust her own voice to form coherent sounds when every dream she had suppressed was suddenly hovering at the edge of possibility. "Thomas told me something in the garden," Frederick said, and his voice was rough and low, and nothing like the cool, formal tones he usually employed when addressing her. And Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she wondered what the child could have said, what innocent observation might have prompted this strange encounter. "He told me that you cry," Frederick continued, and Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet as understanding dawned, as she realized that her careful pretense had been undone by a 6-year-old boy who loved her enough to speak the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. "Every night," Frederick said, and now he was close enough that she could see the lines of strain around his eyes and the muscle that jumped in his jaw. He said, "You cry every night when I leave," and I thought, "God help me, Clara, I thought you hated me. I thought you found my presence unbearable. And all this time you were weeping alone in your chambers while I retreated to my study and told myself it was better this way." Clara opened her mouth, but no sound emerged because she was caught between the instinct to deny everything and the desperate need to finally be known, to finally be seen by this man she had loved in hopeless silence since the day he had offered her his name and his protection without ever offering his heart. The tears she had shed in darkness for so many months now gathered in her eyes in the fading light of the library, and she saw Frederick's expression change as he watched them fall, saw something crack open in his carefully guarded face, And when he reached out and caught her hand in his, she felt the warmth of his touch like a brand against skin that had grown accustomed to coldness and solitude. "I never hated you," she whispered, and the words were barely audible, but Frederick heard them because he leaned closer, his fingers tightening around hers, and in his eyes she saw the first glimmer of the future she had never dared to imagine. The tears fell freely now, sliding down Clara's cheeks in the golden light of the library, where so many silent hours had passed in loneliness and longing, and she found she could not stop them, even though every instinct she had cultivated over 8 months of careful composure screamed at her to pull away, to retreat behind the walls that had protected her from the devastation of hoping for something that could never be hers. But Frederick did not release her hand, did not step back in disgust at her display of emotion, and instead he moved closer still until she could feel the warmth of him, could see the rapid pulse beating at his throat, could read in his eyes a tumult of feeling that matched her own and that she had never dared to imagine she might find there. "I thought you found me repulsive?" Frederick said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that made Clara's heart break and soar simultaneously. "I thought on our wedding night when you trembled at my touch that you were horrified by the bargain you had made, that you had traded your freedom for your family's security and despised me for being the instrument of that necessity." Clara shook her head, unable to find words adequate to express how wrong he had been, how completely he had misread her, trembling as revulsion when it had been nothing more than terrified hope, the fear of a woman who had already fallen in love with a man she believed could never love her in return. "I was afraid," she managed to whisper, "afraid that you would see how much I wanted you to want me, afraid that my feelings would disgust you when you had made it clear this was an arrangement of convenience and nothing more." Frederick made a sound that was almost a groan and released her hand only to cup her face between his palms, tilting her tear-stained cheeks up toward him so that she had nowhere to look but into his eyes, those grey eyes that she had watched across formal dinners and tried so desperately not to love. "I have been the greatest fool in England," he said, and his thumbs brushed away her tears with a tenderness that made fresh ones spring forth to replace them. "I have had a treasure in my home for 8 months and treated it as though it were nothing. I have watched you pour love into my son and my household, and never once thought to ask if any of that love might be meant for me." Clara reached up and covered his hands with her own, holding him there, afraid that if she let go she might wake from this dream to find herself alone again in the cold chambers where she had cried herself to sleep so many nights. "It was always meant for you," she said, "all of it, every moment. I have loved you since you stood in my father's parlour and offered me your name with such grave courtesy. I have loved you through every silent dinner, and every night spent alone, and every morning when I watched you ride away without looking back." And she saw his face transform as her words reached him, saw the ice that had encased him for so long finally crack and fall away to reveal the man beneath who had been just as lonely and just as afraid as she had been all along. Frederick kissed her then, there in the library where the last light of the October afternoon was fading into the soft purple of early evening, and Clara felt the world she had known for 8 months dissolve like morning frost beneath the sun as his lips met hers with a tenderness that spoke of reverence and regret and desperate hope all tangled together in a single perfect moment. She had dreamed of this, had imagined it in the lonely hours when she lay in her chambers and listened to the rain against the windows, and told herself that such dreams were foolish indulgences that would only deepen her pain. But the reality of Frederick's mouth on hers was nothing like those pale imaginings, because it was real and warm and alive with a passion she had never dared to believe he might feel for her. His hand slid from her face to her waist, drawing her closer until she could feel the solid strength of him against her, until there was no space left between them for doubt or fear, or the ghosts of misunderstanding that had haunted their marriage since its very first day. When at last they drew apart, both breathless, Clara found herself laughing through her tears because it seemed impossible that such joy could exist in the same world where she had suffered such loneliness, and Frederick's answering smile transformed his face into something she had never seen before, something young and open and so beautiful that her heart ached with the sight of it. "I have been a fool," he said again, but this time there was wonder in his voice rather than self-recrimination, and Clara reached up to touch his face, to trace the line of his jaw where she had so often longed to touch and never dared. "We have both been fools," she whispered, "building walls when we might have built bridges, assuming the worst when we might have asked for the truth." And Frederick caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Thomas knew," he said softly. "That remarkable boy saw what we could not see." And Clara felt fresh tears gather at the thought of the child who had loved her enough to speak the truth to a father he feared, who had been brave enough to try to mend what the adults in his life had been too proud or too frightened to address. "We must thank him," Clara said, and Frederick nodded, his grey eyes soft with a tenderness she had never seen him direct toward his son before, but which she recognized now as love that had been buried beneath grief and guilt and the fear of loss. "We will do better," Frederick said, and Clara knew he meant not only their marriage, but his relationship with Thomas, knew that the walls he had built around his heart had not only kept her out, but had kept his own child at a distance, that had caused pain she was only beginning to understand. The portrait of Sophia watched from the wall, but for the first time Clara felt no jealousy, no inadequacy, only a quiet gratitude for the woman who had given Frederick his son, and whose memory could now rest in peace as the living finally found their way to each other. The evening that followed their confession in the library felt to Clara like stepping into an entirely different life, one that existed in the same rooms and corridors of Ravenscroft Hall, but was illuminated by a warmth she had never known within these walls. Frederick did not retreat to his study as he had done every evening for the past 8 months, did not disappear behind closed doors and leave her to dine alone with only the ticking of the clock and the crackling of the fire for company. Instead, he offered her his arm and led her to the dining room, where the table had been set for 2, the candles casting a golden glow that softened the formal space into something almost intimate, and when he pulled out her chair himself, rather than allowing the footman to do so, Clara felt tears threaten again at the simple gesture that spoke of care she had hungered for, without ever allowing herself to name the hunger. They sat closer than they ever had before, Frederick having instructed the servants to move his place-setting from the distant head of the table to the seat beside hers, and the meal passed in conversation that flowed with an ease that astonished Clara, even as she recognized that this ease had always been possible, had only been waiting for the walls between them to fall. Frederick asked about her childhood and listened with genuine interest as she described the small country house where she had grown up, the garden her mother had tended, the library where her father had taught her Latin and Greek alongside her brothers, because he had believed that a woman's mind deserved cultivation as much as any man's. She learned in turn about Frederick's years at university, about the friend he had lost in the wars with France, about the dreams he had held as a young man before duty and loss had hardened him into the cold duke she had married. When the meal ended and the servants cleared the dishes, Frederick rose and extended his hand to her once more, and Clara took it without hesitation, marveling at how natural it felt to have her fingers intertwined with his after so many months of careful distance and accidental touches that had burned her with longing. He led her not to the drawing-room where propriety suggested they should retire, but up the stairs to the nursery where Thomas lay sleeping, in his small bed with his toy soldiers arranged on the table beside him, and his face peaceful in the candlelight that filtered through the slightly open door. They stood together watching the boy who had saved them, Frederick's arm around Clara's waist in a possessive tenderness that made her lean into his strength, and she heard him whisper a promise to his son that things would be different now, that their family would be built on love rather than obligation, and Clara added her own silent vow to protect and cherish this child who had given her everything by speaking the simple truth that the adults had been too blind to see. The days that followed their reconciliation unfolded like the pages of a story Clara had never dared to imagine she might inhabit, each morning bringing new evidence that the transformation in her marriage was not a dream from which she would wake to find herself once more alone in the cold corridors of Ravenscroft Hall. Frederick no longer retreated to his study after breakfast, but instead sought her company, appearing in the library where she sat with her needlework, or joining her and Thomas in the nursery, where the three of them would read together from Robinson Crusoe, Frederick's deep voice bringing the adventures to life, while Thomas curled between them on the settee with an expression of contentment that made Clara's heart swell with gratitude. The household staff noticed the change, of course, for servants always saw what their employers believed hidden, and Clara caught Mrs. Colburn smiling to herself as she laid out Clara's morning dress, caught the footmen exchanging glances when Frederick pulled out Clara's chair at dinner or reached for her hand, as they walked through the gardens where the October frost had begun to silver the grass each morning. The portrait of Sophia still hung in the drawing-room, but Frederick spoke to Clara one evening about moving it to a less prominent location, suggesting perhaps the upstairs gallery where family portraits were traditionally displayed, and Clara surprised herself by asking him to leave it where it was because Sophia had been part of his life and part of Thomas's story, and she did not wish to erase her memory, but rather to honor it while building something new. Frederick had looked at her with such wonder in his grey eyes that Clara had felt herself blush like a girl at her first assembly, and when he kissed her forehead and whispered that he did not deserve her generosity, she had silenced him with a kiss of her own because she was learning that she could do such things now, that she had the right to touch her husband and be touched in return with affection rather than mere obligation. Thomas flourished in the warmth of their newfound family harmony, growing bolder in his interactions with his father, climbing onto Frederick's knee during evening readings and demanding stories of when Frederick was a boy himself, stories that Frederick told with a softening expression that revealed the man he might have been all along if grief and duty had not hardened him so thoroughly. Mrs. Colburn reported that the boy slept through the nights now, without the restless tossing that had plagued him before, and Clara knew that children sensed discord even when adults believed themselves successful in hiding it, knew that Thomas's peace was proof that the change in their household ran deeper than mere surface courtesy. The letters Clara wrote to her mother in those weeks were filled with hope she had never expected to feel again, carefully worded missives that hinted at improved circumstances without revealing the depths of joy she was discovering, for Clara had learned through painful experience that happiness proclaimed too loudly might invite the jealousy of fate, and she wished to hold this precious new life close and quiet until it had taken firm root in the soil of daily reality. The weeks became a month, and October surrendered to November with its bare branches and early darkness, and Clara found herself living a life she had never dared to dream during those long months of loneliness, when she had believed herself destined to exist forever in the shadow of a man who could not love her. Frederick had become a different husband entirely, or perhaps not different at all, but simply revealed. The coldness that had characterized their marriage melting away to expose the warmth that had always existed beneath, if only she had been allowed to see it, if only he had been brave enough to show it. They took breakfast together each morning now, lingering over their tea and toast, while Thomas chatted about his lessons and his toy soldiers and the adventures he planned to have when he was old enough to travel, and Frederick listened with the attentive patience of a father who had finally learned that presence mattered more than provision. The evenings belonged to the three of them as well, gathered in the library where a fire always blazed and the candles cast warm pools of light over the books they shared, Clara reading aloud while Thomas drowsed against Frederick's chest and Frederick's hand found hers across the space between their chairs, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that made her breath catch even after weeks of such casual intimacies. The household had transformed along with its master and mistress, the servants moving with lighter steps, the rooms feeling somehow warmer despite the advancing season, and Mrs. Colburn had taken to humming as she laid out Clara's dresses each morning, her satisfaction at the changed circumstances evident in every gesture of care. Clara's mother had written back to her letters with cautious joy, and plans were forming for a visit in the spring when the roads would be passable and Clara could introduce her husband properly, not as the distant Duke who had rescued their family from financial ruin, but as Frederick, the man who brought her flowers from the greenhouse and read poetry to her before bed and looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. Thomas had been told that he was the hero of their story, that his brave words in the garden had saved them all from a lifetime of misunderstanding, and the boy carried this knowledge with a solemn pride that made both adults smile when they caught his satisfied expression as he watched them together. The portrait of Sophia remained in the drawing room, as Clara had requested, but it no longer felt like an accusation or a reminder of her inadequacy, instead becoming simply a part of the history of this family she had joined, a woman who had been loved and lost, and whose memory deserved honor rather than erasure. Frederick had begun speaking of Sophia to Clara, sharing stories of their brief marriage and the joy of Thomas's birth and the grief that had nearly destroyed him when fever took her, and Clara listened and held his hand and understood that loving her did not require him to forget, that hearts were vast enough to hold both memory and new beginnings.